Hello, welcome to the first ever episode of WaffleByte. We're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan. You can find links to our articles in the description, but for now, enjoy the show. In today's episode, we bring you 3 exciting tech stories, including
an update on everyone's favourite little orange cube, the Rabbit R1, and a look at how Amazon aren't doing so well over in India.
We'll then go on to a brief history lesson on the Olympic Games and what the future holds for it given declining viewership numbers and shifts in sports preferences. And for our thought, recently, on Monday 5th of August, over $1 trillion was collectively wiped from the top tech companies in the USA.
Which we'll discuss at the end of the show. But for now, let's dive straight into our first ever episode. Starting off, Rabbit, the company behind the infamous cute little orange Rabbit R1, released a YouTube video sharing their quarterly update this week. And Kuankuan, give me your current brief thoughts about what you think of the Rabbit R1.
For me, I think it's a money grab. People are trying to jump on the AI hype train by releasing a product that doesn't need to exist. It could just be an app on your phone, or more realistically, it will just be incorporated into features by, say, Google or Apple.
They did raise in the tens of millions of dollars, and the revenue from selling these products is estimated to be around $25 million. So they certainly are making a lot of money off it. This quarterly update video, they started off by talking about this idea of a beta rabbit. And I love this branding. The beta rabbit is basically their improved LLM, which will begin being integrated into their R1 product. And the goal is to make beta rabbit much smarter, more capable of reasoning, and also be able to look for and synthesize sources and information all across the internet. Rabbit are taking a very voice-first approach with this, and they're pitching R1 as almost a human, which, for example, may need to ask you follow-up questions to fully understand your query before then giving you a super specific answer to exactly what you wanted, as opposed to the current LLMs, which may give you an answer that they think you might want, as opposed to an answer you actually want. And they claim that this is the key competitive advantage of the R1, the fact that it focuses on voice interactions, whereas most LLM products don't focus on them. For example, ChatGPT is obviously a web interface, and most of these are web interfaces. Even Siri, for example, that's going to be an interface on a big screen and on a phone and with text, as opposed to a voice-first interface. But this this idea of the competitive advantage being the voice interaction seems like a bit of a cop-out, because the device obviously has a really, really small screen, and the controls aren't very detailed. You can't do a whole lot, or you can't interact with the AI a whole lot using just those controls on the Rabbit R1. But equally, I don't think they're lying. I think they genuinely believe this, because they disabled the touchscreen on their original launch product for a reason. And so this must have been their actual vision. But is this a good vision? Kuankuan, do you think the voice-first interaction is where the biggest potential of LLMs lies? Or do you think maybe other interactions like the text-based interaction or maybe even a robotic interaction is more valuable?
Firstly, I think that even if their vision was a voice-first interaction with the rabbit, they could still have given us the touchscreen and the consumer could have had the choice. But in terms of the greatest potential, I think I agree that voice has the greatest potential for change, because we're starting at such a low baseline, whereas in terms of web interfaces, we're a bit more advanced. So in terms of, building new features, new and exciting features, I do think that they're probably right on the voice front. In terms of economic potential, though, I think that in terms of who's willing to pay, it will be businesses. So looking at web interfaces is probably more lucrative, whereas compared to a voice assistant, that will probably be the average consumer who won't be so keen to pay, and it will probably just be a feature that Google and Apple roll out for free, essentially.
In the video, they also stated why they're calling this beta rabbit, and it's so that they can iterate through this LLM really, really quickly, not have to worry about safety or getting that final extra 1% reliability or accuracy that you may want on a public LLM. And I thought that was quite smart of them, right? Because it means that their small startup team can iterate way faster than the teams at Google, for example. And they eventually plan to roll this out across the R1 device as much as possible, and essentially replace the current AI on R1 with this beta rabbit. But does this idea of calling it beta rabbit in the name, does this provide an immoral loophole for AI companies to just not work as hard on safety and accuracy of their model because they just labeled it as beta?
I think it's a fine line to tread. In this case, I do think that if this is to be released to the public, they should take more responsibility in terms of making sure it's safe, it's not spreading misinformation to the best of their ability. Of course, we all know AIs hallucinate quite a bit, and I think crucially it needs to not do what Google's models did when they had to scramble and fix it, because I think that's not right. But obviously, especially for smaller startup companies, you need to be able to iterate quickly. So I think a better way that they could have done it was if they had a team that was internal testing this product, as opposed to releasing it and giving it to end users, which I think is a bit more irresponsible.
Absolutely. They call this a beta, but they don't act as if it's a beta because it's being pushed out to every single user. Whereas, for example, OpenAI, they only push out their brand new products to small groups of users and then slightly bigger groups of users and eventually to everyone. So it's a bit of a contradiction there with Rabbit. Now, the next third of this video that I watched is a comparison between the original R1, Google's Gemini, the Meta AI on the Ray-Ban smart glasses, and the brand new Beta Rabbit R1. Now, firstly, very amusingly, Gemini was very censored. It would refuse to answer any of their questions, like about politics or current affairs and stuff like that. But crucially, I just don't see the improvement to Beta Rabbit. Like, it waffles more, but it still cannot speak like a normal human. It still does not read punctuation correctly, which makes it even harder to understand as it speaks. It feels like what Rabbit did is they just took ChatGPT, gave it a custom instruction, and that's about it. And I actually prefer the Meta AI and the original Rabbit AI, because those responses are much more concise and much shorter. If I wanted all of this detail from Beta Rabbit, a voice-based device is not the way to get detail, right? Especially because, for example, the screen displays links. But that's just stupid because I can't tap the screen to access the link. I can't ask the AI to tell me more about that link. So why are you even showing me a link on this device? So this really does just feel like a slightly fine-tuned GPT, which they didn't even bother integrating very well. They could have at least removed the links from the end of the message. And so I just think this was a really shoddy integration, and I just really wonder what they've been doing for the past couple of months. Anyway, and the final third of this update video, they took clips from reviewers' initial videos and addressed them. But again, they were a bit lazy, right? So they claimed they watched all the videos, which I'm sure they did, but they only clipped clips from 2 videos. One was MKBHD, and I think the other one was from The Verge, but I'm not entirely sure about that. The first clip of a reviewer they played was one of them getting frustrated that the Rabbit R1 can't set an alarm, which is a super basic task. We've had assistants that have been doing this for 20 years that aren't even AI powered. So the founder of Rabbit, his name is Jesse, he said that this feature, this alarm setting feature is rolling out to Rabbit soon. Why is it rolling out soon? Why isn't it already there? Why wasn't it there on launch? What is happening for it to not already be there? And they claimed it would have more intelligence. For example, if you were to ask Rabbit R1 to set a timer for a perfect soft-boiled egg, it would automatically set a 6-minute timer. But that's just not difficult. Google's AI assistant has been doing that for, 6 or 7 years. So I'm just confused. What are Rabbit doing to a timer to possibly make it so complicated that they can't already roll it out? Anyway, the next clip from the reviews they played was saying about how AI still has issues and can still hallucinate. And I mean, obviously that's true. But you know what Rabbit's response to that was, or Jesse's response? He said that the Rabbit R1 is on par with the industry's best hallucination efforts. And that's just a stupid response. If you use a top-end model like GPT, which they are using, then of course you're going to be on par with the industry's best hallucination efforts. That's just dumb. And this was also framed in a whole way that I thought was quite manipulative. It was almost trying to mislead the viewer into believing a certain thing and ignoring all of the other criticisms. Next up, they defended the UX design decisions, like the fact that you can't change the volume or the brightness with your finger by touching the screen. And they said, we are working on it. What are they working on? This feature can be added by an intern in a day or so. It's not difficult. They also defended how they only have 4 apps, which I think is fair enough. It's a new product. It's only going to have 4 apps. But what have they done in the past 3 months? I just don't understand what they've done in the past 3 months. This entire video hasn't shown me anything about what these engineers and this team at Rabbit have done in the past 3 months. So did they just rush so fast to release R1 so early that there's loads of other random issues, for example, on the back end, or random legal issues or company issues that they have to resolve before they can actually begin developing features? And if they did, they just shouldn't have done that, because there's clearly been almost no improvement in the past few months. And finally, the end of this video is crazy. It was It was a massive scrolling list of everything that the R1 can do. He tried so hard to just tell us everything the R1 is capable of, which also obviously isn't much. And Jesse said that the initial reviews don't do justice to where the R1 is now, which I obviously can't comment on that, but I can see validity in that because obviously he's pushed out updates over time. What I will say, it is fairly impressive how much access the R1 gives you to top-end AI tools, for example, Suno AI, ChatGPT, image creation with Midjourney, and so on. And all of that for a one-time price of $200 makes me believe that Rabbit are definitely losing money on every device they sell, which is unfortunate. But Kuankuan, what's your opinion of the R1 now? After I've just described this video to you, what do you think of it? Has any of the information changed how you view it?
No, not really. I still hold my opinion that it's a waste of money from a consumer perspective in terms of the fact that it doesn't add any features that your smartphone doesn't have or doesn't add any particular value. I think from a large language model perspective, they're clearly having to pay GPT and Suno and things like that to be able to use their models. And given that it's a one-time purchase, it leads me to believe that they're making a loss, as you said. And if they don't want to make a loss, well, they're going to charge a monthly subscription. That's pretty obvious, in my opinion, unless they just go bankrupt and then it doesn't work, which is entirely possible. But yeah, for me, I think it's a waste of money. I think if you want to buy it, you have to buy it with the mindset that it's not functional in terms of the AI features. So if you buy it for its physical appearance or its physical form factor, then that's fair enough. But from a functionality perspective, I think there's nothing in there for it.
Precisely. I wanted to buy this just because it looks cool, just so I can put it on my shelf and in 20 years tell my kids the story about this device. Next up, we'll talk about Amazon India. In India, there's been a significant rise in this idea of quick commerce, and there have been loads of startups and services in the past 2 or 3 years that provide this quick commerce service to people. So quick commerce, it refers to the idea of buying something and then receiving your delivery roughly within 1 hour of placing the order. And this is usually in context to groceries, of course, but it also includes pretty much anything else, right? If there's a shop that sells a computer or smartphone, quick commerce can still get that computer or smartphone for you and deliver it to you within an hour in India. The biggest 3 players combined in India are on track to hit $4.5 billion in sales this year. And this is for an industry that basically didn't exist 3 years ago, so that's kind of crazy. Amazon has always and continues to completely ignore this huge market opportunity in India, which allows their competitors to dominate and take all of that 4.5 billion sales for themselves. And obviously, I think this is a huge issue for Amazon from 2 perspectives. Obviously, the first perspective is that Amazon didn't enter this market themselves, and they didn't gain all of this revenue themselves. And the second reason is that not only did they miss out on the opportunity, it now means that these companies that have quick commerce services, they're now stealing customers from Amazon. Why would you ever order a phone from Amazon if you can order it from a quick commerce service and get it the same day for exactly the same price? So obviously Amazon, they aren't doing so well here. And as the market grows in India, the products being offered will only grow more and more and eat more and more into Amazon's product offerings. So whilst right now, for example, maybe only 5% of Amazon's offerings are available in quick commerce, in the next few years that might jump up to 50%, and Amazon would be kind of screwed. The competitive advantage that these new companies have coming onto the scene is really showing here, because their apps, and I googled what their apps look like, and their apps are all much cleaner and much slicker, as they were built entirely from the ground up just for this quick commerce purposes. And their marketing campaigns are also completely different. They offer a vastly unique vibe compared to that of Amazon's marketing, which is clearly very big tech, big corporate marketing. And I think this is excellent. This is why startups are great, because they can challenge the big tech and the big status quo of these companies, introducing a completely new idea. And what we've seen in India in the past 2 years is exactly why startups are great. They've now pushed down Amazon from having relatively big market shares in like 30 or 40% to now it being chopped down to 20 to 30% and chopping down even further every single year. So I'm wondering, perhaps an issue is that Amazon is ultimately headed by people over in the West. Perhaps they've not managed to match the local Indian culture. And perhaps that's the reason why the startups are doing so much better, because those startups are obviously based in India.
Yes, I think that's very true when you observe that Amazon is obviously based in the United States, and when it tries to branch out to international destinations, it often struggles to deal with local cultural factors and adapt its service accordingly. So we see that in China, where Amazon China essentially completely failed, and we have Taobao or AliExpress under the Alibaba Group and obviously PTT Holdings, these companies are essentially gobbling up the market share where Amazon now has none. And I think that the same principle happens in India, where the local Indian culture is not being accounted for by Amazon, and therefore they're struggling when these small startups can pivot much quickly. I think in addition, these small startups, they benefit from essentially low labor costs, right? If you think about this principle of quick commerce, this relies on having loads and loads of people available to deliver your phone that you just bought, or perhaps if you have a grocery order, things like that. It requires on lots of cheap labor, which of course China has and India has as well, and it's something that isn't necessarily viable in the Western world, right? You wouldn't really pay a huge premium to Walmart to deliver your shopping in an hour, where you could either order on Amazon for next day delivery, or go to Walmart yourself and do shop at a physical store, which in both situations would be cheaper because you're having to pay for a premium in the Western world or in the developed world. But in India, because we have access to cheap labor, that is then not a factor, and they are able to offer this service that is distinctive relative to Amazon's services in Western countries.
The parts of this article that really cracked me up was when Jeff Bezos claimed Amazon was being, quote, aggressive in the Indian market. And they've invested billions and billions here in the past few years, and will continue to do that in the next few years. And, I mean, that's technically true. They have been investing billions into AWS, right? Not into their retail side in India, only the AWS side. And this is the vast, vast majority of their Indian investment. So they've clearly not doing enough, and they're clearly not investing in the right places. Whereas Flipkart, which has a majority stake, I think, owned by Walmart, they've been investing a huge amount. I think it's about $1 billion every single year, which is basically the same as Amazon had been investing into retail in the past 3 or 4 years combined. So Amazon seems to have just had a massive misjudgment here, and they still haven't shared plans to enter the quick commerce segment. I'm just wondering, what on earth are they doing in India? Is this the end of Amazon India? Will they just continue this decline? Will they ever be able to dominate e-commerce like they have been doing in the West? Or will they just have to settle for decreasing popularity with consumers and almost fade away into just yet another random big tech company over there?
For me, it's actually not that big of a deal that Amazon isn't putting that much emphasis on retail in India, because in developing countries, people are very price sensitive, right? So you can't really charge a premium for, say, better customer service than your competitors. So as a result, margins will be very low for Amazon in India, and as you said, they have to invest lots and lots to get the operation going. So for me, if they just completely withdraw from the market, I think that's not ridiculous, because Amazon Web Services is clearly more profitable, and if they focus on that instead, then that's a reasonable thing to do, in my opinion, because you're always going to struggle for capturing the local market share and adapting to the local culture as a foreign entity, compared to Flipkart, which, as you said, is based in India, and yes, it's majority owned by Walmart, but it's more of an Indian company. So I think that it's not crazy that is happening, and I'm sure Amazon have in their mind what happened in China, where they essentially got forced out of the market. So I think that perhaps they could make a greater effort in this quick commerce sector, and I think that India is a market where it's more English speaking, so it may be more advantageous for Amazon compared to their failed endeavors in China. But overall, I think it's not ridiculous that they're lagging behind Flipkart and putting emphasis on Amazon Web Services, which is far more lucrative for them.
I somewhat agree, but what is unfortunate is that India is now going to be the biggest market, and as they develop, more and more people get more wealth, they're now going to be spending more, and Amazon does not capitalize on that. They have not got the ecosystem there. Whereas, for example, in the West, if you've used Amazon before and you like it, you're going to buy Amazon Prime. Now you're going to use Amazon for absolutely everything. You're going to buy Kindle, you're going to buy Amazon Prime Video, whatever. And so they're not going to be able to have that over in India, which is unfortunate. But of course, if they do have all of their AWS services in India, then perhaps that doesn't matter, as you said. Analysts believe that Amazon's supply chain, whilst it's very large and sophisticated across the entire world, is the wrong type of service for the Indian consumer, and that it cannot be readily molded to the Indian consumer, because Amazon, for the most part, store the majority of the products that they sell on their website, and they don't necessarily go to a shop to purchase the product and then go straight from the shop to your house. They go from the shop to their warehouse from their warehouse to their delivery center to their delivery center to your house. And this adds so much extra friction that just isn't going to work for this Indian market, compared to, say, Flipkart, which is taking huge chunks of Amazon's market share, which has, of course, been declining in the past few years. Another interesting point is a service called Blinkit, which is a quick commerce startup a few years ago. It was acquired by Zomato, which you might have heard of, 2 years ago for $600 million US. Obviously, a pretty big acquisition, especially in a developing country like India. But what's even more crazy is that Blinkit is now valued at $13 billion US. That's like, what's that, like an 17 times investment increase in the past 2 years? So that's a potential $13 billion missing from Amazon's current evaluation, which is, people suspect, around $20 billion over in India. And they could have essentially just increased their valuation by 50% and continue to increase it by huge strides every single year if they had entered this market a few years ago. So this is quite unfortunate. And I guess this is a lost battle already. And Amazon will probably just have, as you say, that Amazon will have to shift over to AWS in India. The final article we'll look at is following the global IT outage as a result of a faulty Crowdstrike software update from a couple of weeks ago. So Delta Airlines, they're blaming Crowdstrike for all of their huge flight cancellations, which affected over 1 million customers and led to around, apparently, $550 million of lost revenue from Delta Airlines. And Delta is citing negligence. And so they threatened Crowdstrike with legal action, although at the point of recording, no action has been taken by Delta against Crowdstrike. Now, there seems to be lawsuits flying around absolutely everywhere. Customers are suing Delta, shareholders are suing Crowdstrike, people are considering suing each other. Delta attacked Microsoft as well, the government attacked Crowdstrike. There's just everyone attacking everyone. Even the government even attacked Delta, which is kind of crazy. So when Delta said that they might take Crowdstrike to court, Crowdstrike replied saying they will aggressively, and I don't know what's up with the word aggressively in quotes in this episode, but Crowdstrike said they'll aggressively defend themselves should Delta take them to court. I just love this article, right? All of these big companies and organizations are just going to war. So I wanted to spend this segment discussing whether we think CrowdStrike should indeed pay the damages that Delta want them to pay, or whether Delta should just absorb the cost as a cost of doing business.
I think that if you can demonstrate that Delta has indeed suffered a loss because of CrowdStrike, and essentially primarily due to CrowdStrike and not due to their own failures or their own issues, then I think that CrowdStrike should be liable to pay Delta some of their lost profits, I think, and not lost revenue, because the airline industry isn't particularly a high profit margin industry. So if you essentially paying 550 million of lost revenue, then I think that's a bit strange. But Delta, of course, has costs that are associated with cancellations. They have to book people in hotels, or theoretically they have to book people in hotels, but in reality we know that there was a huge kerfuffle and lots of people were stranded, so these people are obviously not happy, and rightly so. I think the US Department of Transportation is looking into it, because there are certain laws that suggest that customers affected need to be compensated, they need to be offered alternative flights, etc. And Delta obviously has to pay for all of this. So if they can demonstrate that CrowdStrike are causing them to have to pay lots of very upset customers, and in addition to losing them lots of profit, then I think that CrowdStrike should have to pay somewhat to that. I think that it is unlikely that it is fully CrowdStrike's fault, because as we realise that other airlines such as United, whilst they cancelled some flights, they didn't cancel nearly as many, so there's got to be some reason why. So probably Delta has an aspect of things that they could have done better, but I think that if they can prove that CrowdStrike are significantly responsible, then they should be paid, because they've lost so much money, and I think that would only be fair.
Delta blamed essentially their own reliance on Microsoft and CrowdStrike and claimed that these two companies failed Delta. And of course, because Delta decided to go so big as to attack Microsoft, Microsoft were quick to respond in saying that Delta had outdated IT infrastructure, which I think could kind of explain how they cancelled so many flights. And Delta claims, in response to this Microsoft claim, that Delta has invested billions and billions into top-tier IT infrastructure in the past few years, which feels like a weak claim, because you can invest a lot and still have bad infrastructure. So I get the impression Delta is just very, very salty. And I disagree with you. I think CrowdStrike should not have to pay a single penny to Delta. I think whilst there is a reasonable expectation for Delta to hope that CrowdStrike services don't crash all of their systems, like, these things will inevitably happen, and CrowdStrike for the most part is very reliable software. And Crowdstrike also claimed that Delta is pushing a misleading narrative because essentially Delta is just very salty, and you can tell that from all of the way they're communicating. But there perhaps is an element of truth to what Delta is saying. Now, shareholders, they're also fighting against Crowdstrike, claiming that Crowdstrike misled them on how good their testing systems were. And I feel like this argument is just absolutely, completely petty. I mean, like, unless Crowdstrike were to release every line of code of their testing systems, I don't really understand the basis of this argument, because obviously Crowdstrike think they have good testing, and they're going to tell the shareholders that they think they have good testing. And when a flaw is found in the plan, can we necessarily blame Crowdstrike? Like, there's going to be some random issue in this massive organization, in this massive code base, one small issue occurring every few years. It doesn't necessarily feel so unreasonable to expect that. And finally, the Delta CEO said, and I quote, "There is no basis, none, to suggest that Delta was in any way responsible for the faulty software that crashed systems around the world." End quote. Okay, so this statement is, I guess, technically correct, because Delta is not responsible for the software that crashed systems around the world. But arguably, they are somewhat responsible for their own systems crashing. I think there were companies that used Crowdstrike software, but that had settings enabled such that Crowdstrike only updates on, for example, 5% of their computers, and then 2 hours later updates on the rest of them. And this slow rollout of Crowdstrike updates on these companies' computers, in theory, would prevent a catastrophic shutdown of all of their services. And very few companies actually had the setting enabled, but it's good security practice to do that. And so you can somewhat blame Delta for not having the setting enabled, because if they did have it enabled, then their losses would only be cut down to maybe $50 or $60 million in lost revenue, which is a lot less than the 550 they're claiming. So I think Delta is obviously somewhat to blame, but I think they're not admitting that they have they're not admitting that they have done something perhaps wrong.
Firstly, when you mentioned the Crowdstrike lawsuits, the shareholders are filing against the Crowdstrike. I think that the thing that it raises is that there's probably a breakdown in communication somewhere along the hierarchy, because obviously the CEO and the executive team interact with the board, and they'll obviously be told by their managers and people like that everything's going great. But I think that between sort of the actual engineers and middle management, there's clearly a breakdown in communication, and things have slipped through. And when the thing that has slipped through has such a huge impact, well, I think that it's important to raise questions as to the processes of Crowdstrike and if there are any problems along the hierarchy of employees. So I think it's reasonable, but as you said, that it's probably not going to lead to much, because if you don't see a problem, then you're going to say that everything's fine, but obviously when the problem kicks in, then everything's not fine. So then it's essentially incompetence that has meant that you haven't seen the problem earlier.
Yeah, I read CrowdStrike's technical report that they released a couple of days ago about the whole incident, and as much as I did say that it could very well just have been a random innocent mistake by a couple of engineers somewhere, the mistake is quite basic. And there were two mistakes. The first one is that they used this technology that you should almost never use in high redundancy applications. So they should have written their code completely differently. The second problem is they updated one of the ways in which they wrote the code, but they didn't check to make sure that the thing they're testing is updated to this method. And so these were two relatively basic issues that CrowdStrike had. And so perhaps it wasn't necessarily just an innocent mistake. Perhaps there was some systematic issue at CrowdStrike that enabled these two errors to pass through.
In terms of Delta, I think that lots and lots of companies, including Delta, could have better IT systems. They could have better IT infrastructure and better ways to deal with things like faulty updates. But I think that, Delta aren't going to say anything that they did wrong, because the Department of Transportation is going after them. So if they say we messed up, then that's obviously not great for them. But in an ideal world, I would like to see more honesty in terms of companies acknowledging that they have problems and trying to fix them. But in a world where, certainly in America, where people are suing each other so frantically, as you said, I think that's just not going to happen. And we have to deal with that, unfortunately. Now I'll talk about the interesting history of the Summer Olympics, and we'll have a discussion with Sourish about, in the future, what can be improved such that more people watch it and it becomes even greater than it currently is. So I think just to start off, we need to be mindful that the Olympics, of course, refers to the Summer Olympics, but also the Winter Olympics. And for today, we'll be discussing mainly the Summer Olympics, which happens every 4 years in the summer, of course, and it rotates around the world in terms of host countries. So most people think that the Olympic Games really started in 1896, but that's only for the modern Olympic Games, and actually the Olympic Games has a long history that dates way back before 1896. In fact, the ancient Olympic Games, held between 776 BC to around 400 AD, was held in Olympia in Greece, which the Olympic Games is named after, and it was held every 4 years in honor of Zeus. Is that right? Zeus? Is that how you say it?
It's Zeus.
Zeus. I'm no Greek mythology expert. So it was held every 4 years in honor of Zeus. And even in these ancient Olympic Games, we would have many thousands of spectators. In fact, some people suggest that up to 40,000 spectators would attend. Now, in the modern day, obviously, that figure is a lot higher, but it just shows that in an era where people struggled to really travel long distances, that the Olympic Games was still such a huge attraction and attracted people to come to watch it because it was such a spectacular event. And the first ancient Olympic Games consisted of essentially just running, but as the ancient games progressed, they added other track and field events such as javelin and other events such as high jump and long jump. However, around 400 AD, the Romans gained power in Greece and the appetite for the Olympic Games started to die down, and it wasn't until the 17th century that countries started hosting Olympic Game-like events and athletes would compete for prizes and medals. So in the UK, there were the Cotswold Games, and in France, the translation would be the Republic Olympiade, but of course that was in French. But in 1894, the International Olympic Committee was founded, and 2 years later, in 1896, the first modern games was held in Greece. Now, the International Olympic Committee has significant jurisdiction over the Olympic Games, and it contacts the national Olympic committees to arrange different countries to participate in the Games. And the International Olympic Committee chooses host cities, which are rotated, and we see recently, of course, the Games was hosted in Paris and previously in Tokyo. So these cities all bid to host the Olympic Games because they believe there will be economic development and attention drawn to the city. But previously, the cost of hosting games was so high that actually there were very few countries that were bidding for the Olympics. So in 1984, the LA Games was held in a backdrop where no country really wanted to host the Olympics because it was so expensive. So in LA, they tried to cut costs by using temporary facilities and using things that were already there and building as few new things as possible. And the LA Games were a massive success. And recently, of course, where only France and Los Angeles were bidding for the 2024 Olympics, the International Olympic Committee has tried to reincorporate some of the cost-cutting aspects of the LA Games to try and make sure that costs are in control, because we observed that in previous Olympics, in previous Summer Olympics, there were massive cost overruns, for example in Rio in 2016 and in Beijing in 2008, where in Beijing they spent over $50 billion adjusted for inflation. Moving on, we'll talk about what the Olympics means. Now, the Olympics has a motto of higher, faster, stronger, and the recently added together. So it's supposed to be an event where the best in the world come to compete and to push the boundaries of human athletic ability. But to smaller nations with few opportunities on the international stage, medals in the Olympic Games actually mean a lot. Compared to, say, the United States, which wins over 100 medals in recent games, smaller countries have very limited opportunity to medal and therefore place great emphasis on athletes achieving gold, silver, or even bronze medals. In fact, in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, they all offer cash prizes of above $700,000 for a gold medal. And in Malaysia, for example, they have a lifetime monthly salary should you achieve a medal at the Olympics. In Russia, it has been a history dating back to the Soviet Union that you would receive expensive gifts such as houses, such as cars, if you do well at the Olympics. So it just shows that lots of countries place huge emphasis on doing well at the Olympics because it puts their country on the international stage, and that's obviously quite beneficial.
I think it's very much their demonstration of prestige or soft power, and that's why they value it so much.
Many athletes gain lots of recognition during the Olympic Games, and they often gain more following and recognition than their sporting careers outside of the Olympic Games. For example, lots of swimmers, Michael Phelps, of course, was always in the news when he would come to the Olympic Games and win very many gold medals. And smaller countries where there have fewer opportunities to participate in international sporting events would also gain more television time and attention from sponsors during the Olympic Games. Quite recently, in the 2024 Paris Games, somebody from St. Lucia got a gold medal in a track and field event, and that country doesn't even have a population of 200,000. So that's obviously quite significant for their country and their people. And Sourish, I don't know if you remember this, but in Rio in 2016, PV Sindhu, an Indian badminton player, received lots of gifts after she won a silver in the women's badminton tournament. Now, as a badminton fan myself, I know that PV Sindhu outside of the Olympics isn't as famous as some other female athletes, but you know, from what I've seen, that she received lots of praise, lots of honours, and lots of money after her silver in the Olympics.
Certainly, I remember seeing that final medal match against Marin, and we also saw Neeraj Chopra, who won a gold medal in the javelin throw in the Tokyo Olympics, and he was just praised all the time. He had like free hotel stays, free airplane rides, and all of that good stuff.
Finally, to note that lots of nations take great pride in ever being able to host the Summer Olympics. For example, in Beijing, they had a huge opening ceremony that was, some say, one of the best ever, and the people, of course, were very enthusiastic and very proud of the country for being able to be in the spotlight for effectively one of the greatest sporting events in the world. And recently, coming back to Paris 2024, some residents actually thought that the Olympic Games were going to be quite shocking, and they left Paris to go on holiday. But the atmosphere around Paris and around the Olympic Games was so good that they actually returned to Paris to try and be part of it. Finally, of course, we have the medal table, which is perhaps reserved for bigger countries such as the United States. And what I find quite funny is that recently some of the US media have portrayed the medal table in a way that is advantageous to the USA, because the USA has the most total medals, but often they were behind in the gold medal ranking, which is the one used by the Olympic organisers themselves. We also see doping allegations between athletes, particularly in US and China, but also other countries, where people are accusing each other of competing unfairly, particularly after they start losing team events such as the swimming relays. But it's important to realise that the Olympics can be often wasteful. In 2004, the Olympics was held in Athens for the second time after the first one in 1896. And the canoe/kayak, the hockey, baseball, softball and beach volleyball venues are all now abandoned as of recording. And the Olympic Village was meant to be converted into affordable housing. However, only half of the units converted were sold, and there were insufficient schools and supporting facilities built around it. And the Media Village was in fact turned into luxury housing, not affordable housing, which is of course not ideal in a country where more affordable housing presumably could only be beneficial. To compare to that, the London Olympics had greater success in terms of not wasting venues, partially because London is of course more developed and they had existing venues already which they could use, so they had to build fewer new ones, but also that they successfully converted the Olympic Village in Stratford to housing. Now, the Olympic Games can also be used as a political event, and often it's been used to send political messages. So actually, 3 Olympic Games in 1916, 1940 and 1944 were cancelled due to the 2 World Wars. And in 1936, right before the Second World War, in Nazi Germany, Hitler tried to use the Olympic Games as propaganda to the entire world, but actually it failed miserably because Jesse Owens, an American athlete who was black, was the most successful and won 4 gold medals, which of course displeased Hitler in his bid to prove that the Aryan race was superior, which of course is complete racism. In 1948, right after the Second World War, the Games excluded Germany and Japan, and in 1968 we had a protest in Mexico City and the army shot over 200 protesters. Finally, in 1972, what's known as the Munich Massacre, Palestinian terrorists kidnapped and killed some Israeli team members, and there was had to be a fight to save some hostages, which ended up being killed. And very recently, we saw just before the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, some protesters set fire on some rail infrastructure and other infrastructure around Paris. So in 1986, the Olympic Games only consisted of 9 sports. They were athletics, fencing, swimming, shooting, gymnastics, cycling, tennis, weightlifting, and wrestling. But in the Paris Olympic Games recently, we have 32 sports, which is, of course, a significant increase. Breaking, which is a type of dancing, was added into the Paris Games. However, it won't be in the LA Games in 2026. And did you know that tug of war was once part of the Olympic Games, though quite sensibly it got cut out, and its stint at the Olympic Games was fairly short-lived.
I wonder though, tug of the war is not necessarily such a bad sport, because it's a team game where strength really matters. So perhaps they should keep that in.
Yes, it could be very entertaining indeed, but we see other sports such as baseball and softball come in on and off, and in 2020 they were introduced, but in this Paris Olympics they were excluded, and perhaps we could do that more in the future, because baseball is quite a big thing in Japan, but maybe not so much in Paris. But finally, I'd like us to discuss about the fact that viewership in the Olympics is declining, and the International Olympic Committee, I'm sure, will want to reverse this trend. So I think for me, one of the things that could be optimised is the medal distribution. So we see some events, such as swimming and track and field, attracting a huge number of medalling opportunities. And in those two particular instances, I think that's fair, because it's very exciting, of course, with 100-metre sprints in the track and field and relays in swimming, and they're very exciting and lots of people tune in to watch them. But in some other sports, such as taekwondo, judo, wrestling, all these sports where perhaps not very many people care or view them, they actually attract lots of medaling opportunities across them. And I think perhaps that's not very fair, because they don't really have a global influence, yet there are so many opportunities for these athletes. And in fact, the International Olympic Committee ranks all the sports by letter grades in terms of how many people watch them, and we have athletics at the top, so that's track and field, that's running, jumping, etc., and karate, skateboarding, sports climbing, and surfing at the bottom, though it's important to note that the last 3 were introduced fairly recently, and so perhaps haven't built up such a following yet. In addition, some sports, such as rugby and golf, which normally have very big followings, don't really have high viewing figures at the Olympics. And I was wondering, that's probably because that in the respective sports, the Olympics isn't regarded as the pinnacle and the best of the best. And I think the Olympic Committee should try and change that, because it's important for the Olympics to be the best events across all sports. And certainly I think that would boost viewership in these otherwise very popular sports. Finally, just my opinion on sponsorship. So the International Olympic Committee says that venues cannot have sponsor logos on them, and athletes can't have clothing which has sponsors on them. And I think that's just a wasted opportunity, because in lots of very big sporting events across the globe, such as the Super Bowl in America, we see ads all over the place, and people are free to support their sponsors. And I think that's very important, given that lots of athletes don't actually make very much money. And even though you see superstars making millions a year playing football, for example, that's often not the case for the vast majority of athletes. So Sourish, do you have any thoughts on how the International Olympic Committee can change the Olympics to make it more friendly to sponsors, make it better for us viewers, and make it go into the 21st century a bit more?
I actually kind of disagree with what you just said. I think the fact that sponsorships aren't allowed, especially in the opening and closing ceremonies, I think that's perfectly fine, because the Olympics is all about this prestige. It's about all 200 nations coming together on this one global stage for like however many 16 intense days. And I think that level of prestige is what you said earlier. That's what attracts attention to sportsmen and sportswomen who otherwise wouldn't get the recognition they deserve. So I think it's the fact that the Olympics is so prestigious that gives these athletes attention in the first place. And so maybe if you did just add sponsors everywhere, maybe that would kind of lower the prestige of the Olympics in the general population's eyes. And so perhaps there is a fine balance to maintain here. And I do know that actually a lot of these athletes, if they build up their personal brand on social media, especially on Instagram, some of them have millions of followers, many of them have hundreds of thousands, then they can prominently display all of their sponsorships and their brand partners on their Instagram pages and still earn huge amounts of money through that.
I suppose that's a fair point, and the Olympics is a chance for athletes to be under the spotlight, and it's up to them to build their personal brand, which they can often leverage to sponsors and bring in sponsorship money. But I think that it's clear that to reverse the decline in viewership, the Olympics need to make gains in, for example, streaming, which is more popular with younger viewers, and, for example, bringing in more youthful sports, shall we say, such as skateboarding and climbing. I think actually are quite good examples of those. So I think they're broadly on the right direction, which is great to see, because I, for one, really enjoy watching the Summer Olympics.
For the first Snappy Bit, I want to talk about this interesting video that I recently saw, and it was talking about Eastern versus Western web or app design. And it essentially pointed out that, for example, Japanese and Korean or South Korean websites, they look very different to the websites we have in the West, even for identical services. For example, the news, e-commerce, social media, they all look very different. They're all designed in a completely different way to how we see them in the West. And essentially, the overall design change is that over here in the West, we like nice and clean and minimal UIs and interfaces that just look nice and modern. But over in Japan and South Korea, their interfaces look a lot messier. It's a lot more cluttered. It's a lot more complicated. And I guess you could also say that it has more information on it. And that's kind of the key bit. Our interfaces don't necessarily have all the information right at your eyes. You might have to go through a few buttons or menus to find the information. But over in Japan, all of their websites are designed to have every piece of information you basically want on that page without you having to click through different menus. And Kuankuan, is Chinese web design and Chinese app design kind of like that of Japan, or is it like that of the West?
It is certainly closer to that of Japan. I think for web design, it's very much more cluttered, and you see lots of links, for example, on a news website. I think a reason for that is because with Mandarin Chinese and Chinese characters, you can fit lots more information. So by essentially cramming lots of information onto one web page, you eliminate the need for having multiple different web pages. I think what's also interesting in terms of web design is that in the West, when you click on, say, Google, you don't have a new tab. So your current Google search becomes your web page that you clicked on. But in China, in almost all situations, when you click on something, you're almost automatically brought to a new tab. And I think that's just super interesting.
I did not know that.
Yes, it's something that I noticed actually quite early on when I came to the UK. But in terms of app design, Chinese apps are super cluttered. And I think partly that's because we have super apps in China. For example, like WeChat, you have so many functions in WeChat that in order to facilitate all of these functions, you almost have to have it to be very cluttered. But in also like Taobao, you have all sorts of promotions. You can collect coins, and that gives you discounts. There are all sorts of really random things, and that means that the app is just super cluttered. There's so many different buttons going on, and it can be really quite a pain to navigate it. But I think that that's just the local, culture and how everybody is used to it. So yeah.
The theory that this video suggested was that having all of this information on one page increases the certainty. And the people in Japan, for example, really value that certainty. And I'm wondering why, because websites, like the internet came about at the same time for both Japan and the USA. So why is our web design so different? And the only explanation I can think of is that it's just so fundamentally deep rooted in their culture versus our culture. And the cultures between the Far East and the Far West are so different fundamentally that Western web design just does not work in Japan. And I find that really interesting and really funky, because it means a Western designer shouldn't necessarily go to Japan and design products for Japan, because they might just completely mess up and just miss a cultural point. Books.
Recently, I've been reading a book on the technological development of the world, but with a focus on China. So it's written in Chinese. It was written by a think tank called the Urban China Initiative, which McKinsey, which is a US consultant company, was actually involved in, and they got in some trouble because the Financial Times reported that they claimed that they had no involvement with the Chinese government, but this think tank clearly had some links with the communist government. But anyway, so they wrote this book on the technological developments that would shape the world in the coming years. And it talked about how China can leverage its advantages and where it might lag behind. It's really interesting. Bearing in mind this book was written about 10 years ago, so it's obviously outdated in certain areas. But it talks about things like, for example, the cloud and how we can leverage the cloud to put services on the cloud as opposed to hosting them locally, etc., which now we all know is quite a big thing, and we have Amazon Web Services, etc. But firstly, what I was particularly amazed by was that the Amazon Web Services market share has barely changed over the 10 years, and I think that's just really impressive given it's such a rapidly growing space and there's so many competitors. Sourish, do you have any opinions on that?
I think once you're tied to one web service or one cloud provider like Amazon, it's very difficult to switch because they build an ecosystem around their own product. And so if you've already started using Amazon, you're probably not going to move away from it. And now, if Amazon was big at the start, for example, there are going to be loads of web developers that have skills in AWS, and therefore AWS is going to be used by companies because they know they can get the best developers who already have skills in this technology. So I'm not too surprised.
In addition, this book highlighted certain risks that China would face when it increases its cloud infrastructure and starts developing technologically into these high-tech areas. And what I found really funny was that in the book, it highlighted a risk being that when you have, when you put data on cloud, then you start having user privacy concerns, which is obviously very true. And when you give away your data, it's not at the mercy of some cloud provider, and if they leak it, if they get hacked, then you're in all sorts of trouble. But in China's case, that's just really funny because the Chinese government has control over everybody's data in China, and so the fact that they highlighted it, which quite validly in terms of their work as a think tank, but then just get completely ignored by the Chinese government, I think that's just quite funny, and it's sort of sad in a way because privacy is so important and such a basic human right that it's just being neglected in China.
I recently finished reading Steve Jobs, which is a biography by Walter Isaacson about Steve Jobs, of course. And at some point in the book, Steve Jobs kind of stated his opinion on the question of, is aesthetic taste individual or universal? And Jobs believed it was universal, as if you could teach someone what good aesthetic taste is and what good design is. And I guess specifically in regards to his products, like, for example, the Mac, he felt like it was his duty as the product designer or the product lead to enlighten people on what a well-designed and a good-looking product looks like. And I think this is a very unique take, but I also kind of agree with this take because why is design like something you can study? Why can you go to university for design? Why can you get certifications in design if it isn't a science? Like, there's got to be some science to it for people to study it, and people study it for a reason, and you get better designers and you get worse designers, and obviously those better designers have objectively better designs. So whilst I think there might be a slight preference that people have between two different aesthetic tastes or two different products, I think ultimately there usually is a right answer. But maybe Steve Jobs looked at it from the point of selling a product to the masses. Like, are 80% of the people going to like this product, or are 70% of people going to like this product? And obviously you want to choose the higher number in that case, and that is easier to quantify. What do you think, Quan?
For me, design is still subjective because people can have differing opinions on a variety of design objects. But I think what you said is true in that you can design something that most people will accept as non-offensive or even nice looking. In terms of, for example, Steve Jobs designing laptops, certainly most people would agree that the MacBook Air, the original MacBook Air, looked quite nice. But you can always have designs that take more risks, and as a result they might appeal to a certain group of people much more than another group of people, and people can have greater attachments to bolder designs and riskier designs. But of course, you're then alienating a large group of people who don't like this design that you took the risk to create. So for Steve Jobs, who was trying to promote his Apple products that were mass market, I think that design is perhaps a science. But if you're looking at other areas such as fashion, for example, then you would be much better served taking risks if you wanted to create a truly outstanding fashion product, I think.
Yeah, interesting how you kind of say design, your design principles vary depending on what industry you're in. And I wonder perhaps if maybe there isn't objectively best design in terms of just like what is the best design for every individual. I wonder if that exists, but perhaps that people disagree on what the best design is, because maybe people, for example, would be more attracted to one product over another product if that product, say, a certain color. Maybe this person likes the color orange a lot, for example, and so maybe they would buy, I guess, a Rabbit R1 just because it's orange. And I think this is kind of like, this can be an explanation as to why people have different tastes when it comes to design and aesthetics, because people may be willing to settle for an objectively slightly worse design if it means there's some sort of emotional or personal connection to the product, and they get some sort of emotional response out of seeing and looking at the product. The thought from the start of the episode was, recently, on Monday the 5th of August, over $1 trillion was collectively wiped from the top tech companies in the USA. And Kuankuan, why on earth did this happen?
So there were really two main causes for this event. One was because some investors were concerned that the AI hype was perhaps too much, and the fact that your revenue generating AI products are still quite a while away, and that therefore at this stage you're seeing lots of capital expenditure but not a lot of revenue brought in by AI, and therefore the valuations of these companies were overinflated. So that's one reason why investors started selling American tech stocks, the Magnificent Seven as we call them, and so that contributed to their valuation decreasing. Another reason was what's called the carry trade. So what the carry trade is essentially, if you have a currency such as that Japanese yen, if you borrow in the Japanese yen, which has a lower interest rate, and then you convert this Japanese yen into US dollars and buy US tech stocks, which are likely to outperform, then you run into a situation where you're borrowing cheaply but you're making a higher return, and that's ideal. Now the situation was on Monday that the Japanese central bank raised interest rates, and the US jobs data was weaker than expected, so people were anticipating the Fed, the US central bank, to cut rates. So when you have a smaller difference between the Japanese yen in this case and the US dollar, then the carry trade becomes less attractive, and in order for people to repay the yen that they borrowed, they have to sell, in this case, American tech stocks to pay back the yen that they borrowed. So because of that, because investors or traders tried to unwind their carry trades, it caused a big sell-off in the US tech stocks. So that was another reason. So that's sort of the two big reasons as to why this happened.
I think the event we saw on Monday, when the Bank of Japan increased interest rates, I think we saw a huge decline in the stock prices, and I think that was like maybe just a one-day issue, because we kind of saw a lot of the stocks partially rebound by a few percent over the course of this week. Of course, they haven't rebounded fully, and so I'm wondering, is the current decline from, say, this week compared to 4 weeks ago, how much of that is due to this AI bubble, or how much is due to the Japanese yen increasing?
I think we see a majority of this event being as a result of the traders unwinding their carry trades. And the reason I say that is because should the AI bubble really be such a bubble, and so should investors panic so much over it, you wouldn't see as big of a rebound as we did. We saw obviously lots of tech stocks start rallying after they crashed quite a lot on Monday. However, if we look at the Japanese stock market, I think that is a bit more long-lasting, because they essentially wiped out all of the gains year to date. But for American tech stocks, I think this is sort of a more of a one-day issue compared to perhaps a wider AI bubble bursting.
The thing that really stood out to me about this whole affair with the Japanese yen is our stock market, or is the stock market in America too fragile? Because if an external country like Japan, for example, can increase their interest rates by a tiny amount, and all of a sudden cause perhaps $1 trillion to just be gone or wiped off from the US stock market, can external countries have this much power over our stock market? And is that bad? Can someone like China or Russia or any sort of adversary take advantage of that?
We see that, all these interconnected events with the Japanese yen and the US dollar. But if you think about it, the reason that they're all interconnected is because we have free currency exchange platforms, so people can buy and sell US dollars and Japanese yen freely. And I think that's very valuable for the global economy. And should you get rid of that, yes, you might see less foreign influence on the US stock market, for example. But ultimately, I think that it's important for the global economy for us to have free currency trading and, in most cases, free stock market trading for both United States investors and Japanese investors wishing to invest in the United States stock market. I do think that it is right for some people to be concerned about, for example, China's influence on the United States, economically speaking, because China, along with Japan, actually holds quite a bit of US debt. And that could have some implications. But crucially, this is dependent on China essentially doing lots of harm to themselves and doing lots of economic damage themselves, should they wish to inflict economic damage on the United States. So from that perspective, I think that we shouldn't be too worried about the interconnected nature of the global economy, and that overwhelmingly it's probably a good thing that we have free currency exchange and things like that. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And remember to follow us on X at the WaffleByte. That's the_WaffleByte. See you there.